The young soldiers laughed when they saw an old man step onto the firing range, carrying nothing but a weathered Winchester rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum. To them, he was out of place, a relic from the past. But the moment his first shot rang out, silence fell. Each bullet struck with unwavering precision, echoing not just across the targets, but through decades of memories. Memories where one missed shot could mean losing a brother in arms. In that instant, they no longer saw an old man. They saw a warrior, with a lesson no modern weapon could ever teach. The morning sun at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, cast a golden haze over the vast training fields, the air heavy with the sharp scent of gunpowder and the buzzing energy of young recruits eager to prove themselves. Private Ethan Miller, a 19-year-old from Kansas, stood at the firing line with his M4 rifle. He was lanky, his frame still carrying the awkwardness of youth, his short blonde hair barely contained beneath his helmet. His pale skin was flushed with excitement, his lips curled into a cocky grin as he bragged about how he would outshoot everyone. Ethan had always been loud, eager to impress, and yet beneath the bravado lay the insecurity of a boy who had never truly faced failure. His voice carried across the line, drawing the amused attention of his peers. Near him, Private Lucas Ramirez adjusted his protective glasses with a steady hand. Lucas, 21, broad-shouldered and dark-skinned with a calm demeanor, had grown up in the crowded neighborhoods of Miami. He spoke little, preferring action over words, but those who knew him realized his silence came from witnessing violence at a young age. His father had been a police officer killed in a gang crossfire when Lucas was 12, and since then, he had carried himself with a quiet determination, the kind of man who observed before acting. At the far end of the range, Staff Sergeant David Ross paced with authority. Ross was in his late 30s, his lean figure taut with discipline, his jawline sharp and covered with a faint trace of stubble. His hazel eyes scanned the recruits like a hawk. Years of service had carved lines into his face, reminders of both desert winds and sleepless nights. Stern but fair, Ross had a reputation for breaking down arrogance and molding raw recruits into Marines. Inside, however, he was weary. He knew that most of these boys thought war was a game, and his burden was to teach them the cost of such illusions. Laughter suddenly rippled across the line. The recruits had noticed a figure approaching slowly, steadily, toward an empty firing position. He was an old man, at least 75, dressed in faded jeans, a plain brown jacket, and a weather-beaten baseball cap pulled low over his brow. His back was slightly bent, yet his steps carried a deliberate certainty. In his hands was an object that seemed out of place in this sea of sleek black rifles, a Winchester M1918, the kind of rifle most had only seen behind museum glass. Private Miller smirked and shouted, "Hey, Grandpa, you lost on the way to the history fair?" The others chuckled, the sound sharp and youthful, full of the arrogance of those who had never been tested. But as the old man, Thomas "Tom" Walker, drew closer, his eyes, clear, piercing blue like the frozen rivers of a northern winter, scanned the range with a calm intensity that silenced some of the laughter. His face bore deep lines, each etched with years of battles fought and burdens carried. His hands, though aged, held the rifle with the ease of long intimacy, as if it were an extension of himself. Ross frowned, stepping forward to intercept the newcomer. He had seen many types of men wander onto his range, but something in Walker's gaze unsettled him. This wasn't the casual look of an old man reminiscing. This was the gaze of someone measuring, remembering, preparing. And as Walker reached the firing line, his rifle resting lightly in his grip, he gave the faintest of smiles, one that hinted not of humor, but of memory. The laughter around him faltered, replaced by a ripple of unease. Then, without a word, Walker set down his small leather case beside him and began to open it. revealing rows of hand-loaded ammunition that glinted faintly in the sunlight. The sunlight glinted off the rows of hand-loaded ammunition as Thomas "Tom" Walker carefully set them in order beside his Winchester. The recruits whispered nervously, their earlier laughter thinning into curiosity. Staff Sergeant David Ross, unsettled yet professional, strode forward, his boots crunching against the gravel, and stopped just short of the old man. His sharp hazel eyes narrowed as he held out a firm hand. "Identification and range card, sir," he said, his voice calm but edged with the authority of habit. Without hesitation, Tom reached into the pocket of his weathered jacket and pulled out a laminated card. His fingers, knotted with age but steady as stone, handed it to Ross. The sergeant studied the card, his brows rising. The name was clear: Master Sergeant Thomas Walker. Service years: 1968-1990. Branch: Special Forces. His mind raced. This wasn't just any veteran. This was a man who had endured decades of service, through conflicts that had scarred both the land and the men who survived them. Ross turned the card slowly, examining its authenticity. The photo, taken decades ago, showed a younger Walker with the same piercing blue eyes, though less burdened by time. "Vietnam, twice?" Ross asked, his tone shifting from suspicion to guarded respect. Tom gave a single nod. "5th Special Forces Group. Long time ago." His voice was quiet, steady, a tone of someone who had long since stopped boasting about what most could not imagine. The recruits had grown quiet. Private Ethan Miller, his grin fading, now studied the man with a mix of unease and reluctant admiration. He muttered under his breath, "Special Forces? No way." Private Lucas Ramirez, ever observant, watched Tom intently, noticing the way he handled the rifle with reverence rather than showmanship. Lucas felt a strange pull of respect, recognizing the weight behind the old man's calmness. As the silence stretched, another figure approached, the range safety officer, Gunnery Sergeant Harold Jenkins. Jenkins was in his mid-40s, thick-set with broad shoulders, his hair buzzed short, his jaw covered in a coarse salt-and-pepper beard. His left hand bore the faint scars of burns, a remnant from an IED blast in Afghanistan years earlier. That scar had hardened him. He trusted little, questioned everything, and carried himself with the suspicion of a man who had seen too much betrayal in too many deserts. He adjusted his cap and gave Ross a questioning glance before shifting his gaze to Tom. "What kind of antique are you planning to fire here?" Jenkins asked, his deep voice tinged with cynicism. Tom's lips curved into the faintest smile as he lifted the Winchester with care. "She's been with me longer than most men keep friends. Reliable as the sun. Winchester M1918, 30-06. The recruits glanced at one another, some wide-eyed, others scoffing quietly. Jenkins crossed his arms, still doubtful, though something in Tom's calm voice pricked at his hardened exterior. Ross handed back the card slowly, his expression unreadable. "Master Sergeant Walker," he said, louder this time so the recruits could hear. "You've been cleared, but understand this is no museum, and these men are here to qualify. If you're stepping onto my line, you'll be judged by the same standard." Tom nodded once, his eyes meeting Ross's without flinching. "That's all I ask." As he lowered himself into position beside the younger soldiers, the recruits leaned forward, their curiosity sharpened. Ethan whispered, "What if he really can shoot?" Lucas didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the old man's steady hands. Then Jenkins barked out the next command, his gravelly voice echoing across the range. "All shooters prepare weapons. Range goes hot in 60 seconds." The tension in the air thickened, and every pair of eyes turned toward Tom, waiting, doubting, wondering, just as his fingers slid around into the chamber with a metallic click that rang louder than any laugh. "Range goes hot in 60 seconds. The echo of Gunnery Sergeant Harold Jenkins's command still lingered as silence gripped the recruits. The seconds crawled, every man adjusting his stance, fingers twitching nervously on triggers. Private Ethan Miller licked his lips, trying to hide the tremor in his hands. His helmet seemed too heavy now, his once proud grin fading as he risked another glance at the old man beside him. Thomas "Tom" Walker was unnervingly calm, his rifle steady in his lap, his blue eyes fixed on the distant silhouettes as though he could already see the holes he would carve into them. The first whistle pierced the air. Targets jerked upright in the distance. Immediately, the range exploded with the rapid chatter of M4s. Bursts of gunfire cracked and echoed, shells clattering against the gravel. Ethan squeezed his trigger frantically, his shots scattering toward the 200-yard target. To his right, Lucas Ramirez remained measured, firing in steady rhythm, each shot purposeful, his broad shoulders firm against the recoil. Then came a different sound, cutting through the noise like thunder rolling across a storm. A single deep boom. The Winchester barked, its recoil rocking against Tom's thin but unshaken frame. The old man did not rush. He breathed, exhaled, and fired again. Boom. The sound was older, slower, more deliberate, but it carried an authority the younger rifles lacked. Each time the echo faded, a faint metallic clang answered from the farthest targets. Private Miller flinched. He had expected the old man's weapon to misfire, maybe even jam. Instead, every blast of that antique seemed to shame the rapid fire of the M4s. His frustration mounted. Sweat trickled down his temple as he fired faster, trying to drown out the heavy cadence of the Winchester. Staff Sergeant Ross paced behind the line, his sharp eyes catching details others missed. He saw Miller's frantic aim drifting wide, saw Lucas's discipline holding firm, and saw Tom's uncanny stillness, a stillness Ross recognized from his own years in combat. It was the stillness of men who had learned to let chaos swirl around them while they carved out precision. Meanwhile, Gunnery Sergeant Jenkins folded his scarred arms, his skeptical gaze narrowing with each of Tom's shots. Jenkins had doubted this man, doubted his rifle, doubted everything about his presence. Yet the sound of steel ringing on distant targets told him a truth he could not deny. A young recruit at the far end, Private Nathan Cole, caught himself pausing mid-shot to stare. Nathan was 20, with a mop of unruly brown hair and freckles across his pale face. He was timid by nature, a boy from rural Iowa who had joined the service to escape obscurity. His wide eyes now locked on Tom, and for the first time since boot camp, Nathan felt what it meant to witness mastery. Then, as the final seconds ticked away, Tom inhaled deeply and aligned his sights on the farthest 500-yard silhouette, a Eisenhower, target so distant it shimmered in the haze. The Winchester roared one last time. For a heartbeat, the range seemed to hold its breath until the faintest clang drifted back, unmistakable. "Cease fire!" Jenkins bellowed, his voice hoarse. The chatter of rifles died, leaving only the acrid scent of gunpowder and a tense silence. All eyes turned to the distant targets, but from this range, the details were unclear. Recruits craned their necks, murmuring anxiously. Ross lifted his binoculars, his face tightening as he adjusted the focus. What he saw made him inhale sharply, but before he could speak, Jenkins snatched the binoculars from him, his scarred fingers trembling. His jaw slackened as his eyes locked on Tom's final target. The range had gone still, the echoes of gunfire fading into the crisp Carolina air. The recruits shuffled nervously, some tugging at their helmets, others wiping sweat from their brows. Staff Sergeant David Ross lowered his binoculars slowly, his expression caught between disbelief and duty. He had seen skilled shooters in his time, but what he had just witnessed unsettled even his hardened instincts. The farthest target, nearly invisible to the naked eye, bore a cluster so precise it seemed almost unnatural. Gunnery Sergeant Harold Jenkins still held the binoculars, his scarred hand tightening on the grip, as if by squeezing harder, he might force the truth to change. His salt and pepper beard twitched as he muttered, "No way in hell." His voice, usually gravel and command, now cracked with astonishment. Private Ethan Miller's stomach twisted. He had fired recklessly, certain that speed would impress, but now he stared at his own target riddled with scattered shots, most off-center. His pride burned hotter than the midday sun, humiliation clawing at him. He wanted to shout that it wasn't fair, that age shouldn't outshine youth, yet his throat locked. He glanced toward Tom Walker, who was calmly ejecting the last clip, his movements methodical, unhurried, as though the entire exercise had been no more stressful than tying a bootlace. Private Lucas Ramirez set his rifle down carefully. His disciplined grouping looked decent by normal standards, yet even he felt small compared to the flawless pattern Tom had carved into the steel. Lucas exhaled slowly, his respect deepening. He recognized mastery when he saw it, and unlike Ethan, he welcomed the chance to learn. At the end of the line, timid Private Nathan Cole gripped his weapon with clammy hands, his wide brown eyes darting between the old man and the distant silhouettes. He thought of home in Iowa, of days hunting rabbits with a rusty .22 rifle, and realized he had never understood what accuracy truly meant until now. "Retrieve the targets," Ross barked, his voice firm, though his chest felt tight. Two range assistants jogged forward, both younger Marines tasked with scoring. One of them, Corporal Henry Dwyer, was a red-headed man in his mid-20s with freckles across his broad nose. Known for his quick temper and faster jokes, Henry was suddenly silent as he trudged toward the targets, clipboard tucked under his arm. The other, Lance Corporal Sam Perkins, was lean, dark-haired, with a studious expression. Sam had grown up in a family of teachers, and his tendency to overanalyze often slowed him down, but here he walked with careful precision, sensing that what he was about to record would matter. The minutes stretched unbearably as the two men returned with the first sheets of scored paper. Conversations died, the recruits craning their necks, their cocky bravado drained. Dwyer glanced down at Tom's 300-yard target, his freckles paling as he traced the tight grouping with his finger. "Dead center," he whispered, forgetting himself. Perkins looked at the 500-yard target, his lips parting. The holes were clustered so perfectly it looked like one gaping wound in the center. He stopped walking, staring in open disbelief, then raised his head toward Jenkins, his voice barely audible. "Gunny, you better see this yourself." The scored targets lay spread across the table at the center of the range, fluttering slightly in the breeze as if reluctant to reveal their story. Corporal Henry Dwyer's freckled face was flushed as he handed the sheets to Gunnery Sergeant Jenkins, who inspected them in silence. The recruits crowded closer, the air heavy with tension. All eyes darted between the scored holes and the old man who had made them. Thomas Tom Walker stood quietly, cleaning his Winchester, his movements deliberate, his weathered hands betraying neither pride nor arrogance. Ethan Miller could no longer keep the words inside. His voice cracked, the swagger gone. "How? How did you do that?" His youthful face was pale, his blond hair damp with sweat. He looked less like the brash boy who had mocked, and more like a child who had just realized the world was far larger than he had imagined. Tom glanced at him, the corners of his eyes creasing, not in amusement, but in the weight of memory. His voice was low, even, carrying farther than shouting ever could. "You boys came out here to earn a score, to outshine one another. I came out here remembering that missing meant one of my brothers would never go home." The words struck harder than any bullet. Lucas Ramirez straightened, his dark eyes fixed on Tom, recognizing truth when he heard it. Nathan Cole swallowed hard, his freckles paling as he thought of the simplicity of his own motivations for joining, compared to the brutal reality behind the old man's. Staff Sergeant Ross, who had seen arrogance stripped from recruits before, felt something different here. This was not a lecture from an instructor. This was the weight of lived experience, pressed into the air until it suffocated every trace of laughter. Gunnery Sergeant Jenkins cleared his throat, but the gravel in his voice was muted. "What do you mean by that, Walker?" Tom paused, setting down his cloth, his blue eyes far away. "Vietnam, 1969. We were pinned down by a sniper for hours. My men were panicking, some already bleeding. One muzzle flash gave him away. 400 yards, iron sights. I had one chance. I didn't think of points or perfection. I thought of the faces of the boys beside me and how they'd die if I failed. I didn't miss." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Even the birds above seemed to stop their calls. Ethan's jaw worked as though he wanted to respond, but no words came. The recruit stared at Tom not as a relic, but as a man forged by fire. Tom exhaled slowly, resting his hand on the worn stock of his rifle. "That's the difference. You shoot for paper. I shoot for lives." At that moment, a voice called out from the observation tower at the far end of the range. It was Captain Sarah Whitfield, the officer overseeing training that day. Sarah was in her early 40s, tall and slender, with auburn hair tied tightly beneath her cap. Her skin fair but weathered by years of service in desert deployments. Known for her sharp intelligence and uncompromising standards, she was both respected and feared by her subordinates. Her commanding tone cut across the field. "Master Sergeant Walker, I think it's time you explained yourself to all of us." Captain Sarah Whitfield's voice had hung in the air like a gavel, striking the silence. In the days that followed, whispers spread across Fort Bragg like wildfire. The story of the old veteran with the antique Winchester who outshot an entire line of recruits reached every corner of the base. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, others leaned in with awe, but by the third Saturday morning, Thomas "Tom" Walker returned to the firing line, and this time, he wasn't alone. At first, only a handful of Marines waited for him. Private Ethan Miller stood at the front, his cocky grin gone, replaced by the earnestness of a boy desperate to learn. His blond hair was combed neatly, his uniform sharper than usual, as though discipline alone might impress his unexpected mentor. Next to him was Lucas Ramirez, quiet and steady as ever, his broad frame relaxed, but his dark eyes alive with anticipation. Behind them, shy Nathan Cole clutched his rifle awkwardly, freckles standing out against his pale face, his determination outweighing his nerves. Among them was a new face, Sergeant Paul Grayson, a tall man in his early 30s with cropped black hair and a rugged jawline that bore a thin scar running from cheek to chin, the remnant of shrapnel during a deployment in Iraq. Grayson's reputation on base was complex, respected for his bravery, but known for his short temper and skepticism of authority. He had come not to admire Walker, but to challenge him, to see if the legend was real. His hazel eyes narrowed on the old man with quiet defiance. Tom said little at first. He set down his leather case, opened it, and revealed the familiar rows of hand-loaded rounds. He cleaned his rifle, his hands moving with patient precision. The recruits fidgeted, waiting for instruction. Finally, Tom looked up, his piercing blue eyes sweeping across them. "If you're here for tricks, leave. If you're here to learn discipline, stay." The words struck them differently. Ethan stiffened, eager to prove he wasn't just a loudmouth. Lucas nodded silently, already aligned with the old man's philosophy. Nathan swallowed hard, but stayed rooted, his resolve surprising even himself. Grayson smirked faintly, folding his arms, his scar pulling taut across his cheek. "Discipline's one thing," he muttered under his breath. "But let's see if you can teach it." Tom began with the basics, but not as they expected. He made them lie prone without firing a single shot, forcing them to breathe in rhythm with their heartbeats, to feel the weight of silence before squeezing a trigger. Hours passed, sweat beading on brows, shoulders aching from stillness. More Marines drifted in, curious at first, then compelled to join as they watched. By the end of the session, Ethan's groups on the 200-yard targets were tighter than ever. Lucas's calmness showed in his precision. Nathan, though still shaky, had placed his shots closer to center than he believed possible. Even Grayson's skepticism wavered as he adjusted his sights under Tom's quiet correction. But just as the sun dipped low and the recruits thought the lesson was ending, Captain Whitfield approached again, her auburn hair glowing in the twilight. Her eyes were sharp, but her voice carried a weight of decision. "Walker," she said firmly, "if you're going to keep training my men, we need to make this officiatory." 6 months had passed since Captain Sarah Whitfield had walked onto the range and challenged Thomas "Tom" Walker to make his lessons official. In that time, Fort Bragg had changed in ways few could have imagined. Saturday mornings that once echoed with hurried drills and restless chatter now carried a different rhythm. Recruits arrived early, laying out their rifles in tidy rows, waiting in anticipation for the arrival of the quiet old man with the ancient Winchester. Tom never came with fanfare. He walked slowly, his weathered boots crunching gravel, the leather case in one hand, the rifle in the other. His hair had grown whiter, his back perhaps a little stiffer, but his presence commanded respect more powerfully than any shouted order. He taught with patience, drilling the fundamentals over and over: breathe, aim, squeeze, follow through. Yet it wasn't just marksmanship he instilled, it was reverence. Private Ethan Miller, once the loudest voice on the line, had transformed into the most focused student. His blonde hair still caught the sun, but his cockiness had been replaced by discipline. Chosen for sniper training, Ethan now carried himself with quiet confidence, every movement deliberate, every shot a lesson in restraint. Lucas Ramirez, steady as stone, became a mentor to others, his calm demeanor echoing Tom's own. Nathan Cole, the timid boy from Iowa, no longer shook at the line. His freckles were still there, but his eyes now carried determination. Sergeant Paul Grayson remained the hardest to sway. His scarred jaw gave him a perpetually defiant look, but week after week, even he found himself drawn in. Under Tom's guidance, his temper cooled, his skepticism softened, and though he rarely admitted it aloud, he grew to respect the old man who had nothing to prove, yet proved everything. Captain Sarah Whitfield, ever vigilant, watched from the tower or walked the line. Though her auburn hair was streaked with new silver, her eyes softened each time she saw the recruits improving beyond expectation. Her decision to legitimize Tom's role had become one of the wisest of her career. The culmination came during battalion qualification day. Alpha Company posted the highest marksmanship scores in years. Commanders praised discipline, officers marveled at the numbers, but those who had stood on the range knew the truth. It wasn't just about tighter groupings or higher scores. It was about the mindset Tom had instilled, that the rifle was not a toy, not even just a tool, but a lifeline. Weeks later, a modest plaque appeared on a wooden post near the firing line. Its metal surface gleamed under the sun, simple words etched with quiet dignity. Dedicated to Master Sergeant Thomas Walker, who reminded us that weapons do not make warriors, warriors make the weapon. Tom never asked for it, never mentioned it. Each Saturday he still appeared, setting up his gear, teaching young Marines with the same patience as before. He fired, his Winchester, the deep boom echoing across the field, a sound that no longer drew laughter, but respect. And as fresh recruits stepped forward to learn, they carried not just lessons of marksmanship, but the spirit of a man who had turned survival into wisdom, and wisdom into legacy. The story of Master Sergeant Thomas Walker reminds us that true strength does not come from the weapons or tools we hold, but from the discipline, patience, and heart we carry within ourselves. In our daily lives, whether it's facing challenges at work, supporting family, or overcoming personal struggles, it is not the circumstances that define us, but the way we rise to meet them. Like Walker's lesson on the range, every choice we make has weight, and every small act of courage builds a legacy for those who come after us. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who could use a little inspiration today. Leave us your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your reflections. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story of courage, love, and hope. Until then, may your days be steady, your challenges met with patience, and may you always find the strength to aim true in life's battles. God bless you, and see you in the next story.